I'm going to speak about a very, very controversial issue, but it's also an important issue, which is that of what I call natural disvalue. So what is natural disvalue? By natural disvalue, I mean the disvalue that occurs for natural reasons, right? That is, the disvalue that occurs not because we humans cause it, but rather because it's there. And it's not a very good term, because we could say that the harm that we cause is also natural, because we don't come from any supernatural dimension. But it will do to understand what we are talking about here, which is basically the question of whether what occurs in nature, regardless of our action or interaction with nature, can be considered something positive, or can be considered instead something disvaluable. That is something that we should try to change, because it's something that has very bad dimensions. So the way in which I'm going to argue that there is a huge amount of natural disvalue and that we should be concerned with it is that animal suffering prevails, and it's not just that prevails just slightly, that overwhelmingly prevails in nature over animal well-being, animal happiness, and all that. And I'm going to start by presenting the next thought experiment, which I call the case of natural hell. And it goes like this. Suppose, consider a natural hell. So it's an untouched natural environment in which this huge number of sentient beings are suffering terribly and are dying very prematurely, just after coming into existence. And then enters paradise from intervention. And paradise from intervention changes everything. So what happens is that we alter in some way natural hell, and sentient beings now live in a paradise. So I think that most of us would believe that it would be good to move from natural hell to paradise from intervention. So what would follow from this is that maybe we should intervene in nature, or try to do something about that to improve the situation of those animals that are suffering in nature, that are in some hell in nature. But of course, against this conclusion, we could present several objections. And the four ones that I want to examine here is this. The first one is what I call the idyllic view of nature, which claims that nature is not like natural hell, but actually that nature is a paradise. And this is a view that is held by many, many people. Actually, I think that most people have this belief. Then the second way to object to this conclusion that I presented before is what I call the speciesist view, which basically claims, well, who cares about non-human animals? By speciesism, I mean the discrimination of those who don't belong to a certain species, in this case humans. So many people hold the view that we shouldn't really be concerned with animals simply because they aren't humans, so we should just be concerned with human interests. So if this is so, who cares whether nature is a hell or a paradise or whatever? We should just care about whether is it good for us or not. Then the third view is what I call the environmentalist view, which claims thou shalt not alter nature, which claims that nature is something sort of sacred, something that has some value in a mysterious way maybe, and that we shouldn't really mess with that, even if in nature there is suffering and so on. And then the fourth position, the fourth objection, would be what I call the pessimistic view, which claims simply that intervention can't succeed. So maybe it would be good to improve the situation of animals in nature, but whatever, we can't really do it. We will fail if we try. So I'm going to examine all these different objections and see if they work against the conclusions that I presented before. So let's start with the first one, the idyllic view. Nature is paradise. Why? I'm going to claim that the idyllic view is wrong. And for that, I'm going to present two versions of this argument. The first one claims that living in nature is good for all animals, even if their lives just contain suffering and premature death. Some people hold this view because they claim that, well, that which is good for animals is just the fact of living in nature and being free and so on, right? And then there is this weak version of the argument, which claims that on the overall, in nature, well-being outweighs suffering. So even if, I mean, the weak version doesn't deny that there is suffering in nature and that for this reason many animals live terrible lives, but it claims that there is also happiness, and happiness counts for more, right? So well, I'm going to claim that the strong version is unacceptable if we believe that well-being is value. Because how come you can say that the life of a being who just comes into existence and then suffers and then dies is good for that individual? I mean, the conception of value that is sustained in this view is weird, to say the least, and unacceptable, to say something rather more clear, right? Because that which is good for us is just the fact that we have positive or experiences, and that which is bad for us is having bad experiences. And then the weak version is wrong, and this is the main point here, because the strong version can be easily rejected, but the weak version is a bit more controversial. And I'm going to explain why the weak version may be rejected. And to do so, we can take a look at how population dynamics works in nature. That is, how population dynamics of how animal population dynamics works. And to see this, we can consider this equation of population dynamics that is the main one that is used in this field, which can be presented in this way. So I don't know, many of you may not be familiar with this and may see this formula. This happens when you speak with philosophers. Sometimes they aren't familiar with this stuff. Sometimes they are. Depends on the tradition in which they work. And well, strange as it may seem at first, this is the main reason why nature is hell. So it may be surprising that this is so. So I'm going to present what this is about. So in this equation, t is a certain period of time, and is the initial population size of a population of animals, say for instance a population of frogs or fish or birds or whatever, when t starts. Then r is the reproductive rate of that population, and k is the carrying capacity of the environment in which this population is, right? So what this equation says is that the way in which a population varies through time, that is, the way in which the number of this population is increased or reduced, it depends on these two factors. That is, how many offsprings come to existence, how many eggs, how many new birds, mammals, fish come to existence, and then how many of them may survive, which is determined by, as I say, the carrying capacity. How many of these individuals the environment can sustain. So let me explain this in more detail. We have that for a certain time t, a population whose initial number was n will vary depending on the two things I've just mentioned. You see it here? Is this clear? Okay, you got it, right? Okay, then let's move on. What happens then is that if we have these two factors, we can understand easily what happens in nature. And what happens in nature is that there are two main reproductive strategies that prevail. That is, how can animal population go on through existence? By following two different reproductive strategies. The first one is maximize k, and it's called k selection. And this entails that you are going to maximize the number of individuals that will survive, right? So if I have two children, I may somehow take care of them very carefully so that I will make it possible that both of them survive. So this means maximizing k, right? I don't know how many of you come from the field of biology. Those who come from that field, you know this already. But since others may not know it, I have to explain it. And then there is R selection. And what R selection maximizes is the number of beings that come into existence. So this isn't like it's not that some animals are K strategists and some animals are R strategists, but rather some animals are mainly R strategists, some other animals are mainly K strategists. So these strategies are mostly mixed. But what happens, nevertheless, is that unfortunately R selection prevails. And this is an example of this. You may not see clearly at first what this picture is, but if you pay attention, you will see that there are different individuals. You can see their eyes. So these are a bunch of individuals that have just come into existence, right? So this is an example of R selection, right? And what happens is that, well, this is the key of the issue. On average, if a population is stable, just one individual per parent survives. So R selection works as follows. We have 2 individuals at time 0, right? Then we have, say, 10,000 individuals if these animals lay 10,000 eggs at time I. And then at time t, which comes after 0 and after I, we just have again 2 individuals at time t. You understand why this happens, right? If a population is stable through time, if at time 0 we have a certain number of individuals, then at time t, after a while, we will, in the next generation, we will just have the same number of individuals. So of course, we can wonder what's going on here with those 10,000 individuals. Where do the other 9,998 go? And what happens is that most of them die shortly. They die in misery. What happens to them? Well, suffering is maximized for these animals because they starve, they are killed by other animals, they die in other ways. So for most animals, what happens is that they come into existence and they may never eat and just starve. Or they come into existence and then eaten by other animals, right? So the lives are so short that they don't have time enough to have many positive experiences. But they do have the experience of starving, of dying, which is quite painful, even for these animals. So we can understand that for our strategists, most animals, the overwhelming majority of them, live lives that are not precisely very good lives, actually. So suffering is clearly prevailing for these animals, right? And unfortunately, what happens is that R selection is vastly prevalent in nature. Cancellation is just an exception. Like you have, for instance, some mammals such as elephants and apes and, gazelles, for instance. And then you have some birds, very few birds, like big birds that may just lay one egg and take care of the chick and so. But in most cases, what we have is R selection. Even in the case of animals who do take care of their offspring, usually they combine it with R selection too. Like for instance, if you consider mice or dogs, they don't have one child each time, right? So that means that most of them will die, unless, for instance, they are social animals. Like for instance, we have an exception here in the case of wolves, because in the case of wolves, not all of them reproduce, just the leaders of the group and so on. But anyway, R selection is vastly prevalent. So what happens is that most animals have huge litters or clutches. So these are just some examples. Bullfrogs can lay up to 20,000 eggs. Cods can lay up to 9 million eggs. I know that you say cod, but cods is a plural term in English, so I use it just to consider animals as countable, not uncountable. And some fishes can lay up to 300 million eggs. So you can now guess the astonishing dimension of the suffering that there is in nature, right? So we can conclude that most species follow a reproductive strategy that entails that most of the members die very soon, right? Die in pain. So this is why the idyllic view is wrong, right? So, in addition to this, we can also point out that many adult animals often suffer during their lives. Even if they make it to maturity, they may suffer from diseases, from parasitism, injuries, harsh weather conditions, malnutrition, and so on, right? So these are additional reasons to consider that life in nature is no paradise. So that's why we have to conclude that the first objection must be rejected. And it's not just that it's wrong, it's very, very wrong, right? So this is very counterintuitive. And I couldn't believe it at first. So it's not that I don't like nature or whatever, so I try to find this argument This was shocking to me at first, and I wanted to resist. And I said, no, this has to be wrong, so let's do more research. But the more research you do on this, the more this is confirmed. So at some point you have to say, well, okay, I have to surrender to how things really are, whether I like it or not. So unfortunately, we live in a place that is surrounded by suffering. That's how things are. Sorry, but I'm just telling about this. It's not my fault. But then we have the speciesist view, which claims, as I said before, who cares about nature, about non-human animals. So we can reject this view for a number of reasons. And the first one, well, first of all, let's see what does the speciesist view entails. It claims that we should not intervene in nature because wild animal interests count for little or nothing. But can we really defend this? Because if we just cared a little for wild animals, we should help them. So suppose we are speciesists. We believe that we should care for humans and the animals don't count that much after all. The fact that there are so many, even if you just count this little, this animal counts this little, this animal counts this little, and so on. Because there are so many, some estimations are that there are like 10 to the power of 19 or even more animals. Then on the overall, they should count a lot. So the speciesist argument just counts if no consideration whatsoever should be given to non-human animals. And this is a very, very counterintuitive position, or crazy positions, we may claim. And there are further reasons that we should consider here. And the first one is that well-being matters. So if well-being matters, it can't be just that human well-being matters, but also the well-being of other animals should be considered as well. And this is so for any view that is concerned with well-being, either egalitarianism, utilitarianism, and any ethical position that accepts this. So the identity of the ones who have that well-being shouldn't be really considered. So since no human animals have a well-being, wild animals matter too. But then we should also consider that impartiality blocks speciesism. Because we can perfectly imagine a situation in which we were in the position in which wild animals are. And in that situation, we would all prefer to be helped rather than to be left to die in misery. So if we didn't know, suppose that we are in a completely impartial situation and we don't know if we're going to be humans or non-human animals. Of course, we can think about that if we have in mind that we are actually humans, but this is just a thought experiment. If we follow this thought experiment, we would reject speciesism, right? So hence we have to conclude that impartiality requires helping wild animals and rejecting speciesism. And then another thing that we may point out here is that no argument for speciesism succeeds. First, many arguments for speciesism beg the question when they claim, well, it's just that because humans are humans that we should care for them. Well, but that's just like saying we should just care for those whose names start with the letter, I don't know, O, for instance. It begs the question because it doesn't give any further reason for that. It's just assuming in the premises the very conclusion it wants to reach. And this happens, as I say here, when speciesism is defended in what I call a definitional way. Just giving saying per se that per definition we should care for humans is saying nothing, right? So in other cases, speciesism is defended by means of a criteria that can't be verified, as when it's claimed, we humans are the favored species by God. Whatever, because we can't verify it, we are begging the question again. So, as I say, we should reject this argument. But then, we also have a further argument for other defenses of speciesism, because speciesism is sometimes defended by claiming that humans should be considered because humans have some special capacities. Like, for instance, they have some cognitive capacities that no other animals have, that they have certain special relationships with each other. So, for instance, we should consider humans because they are in a situation of power that is similar to the one in which we are, but because we are more powerful than non-human animals, we should exploit them, or because we feel sympathy for humans and not for non-human animals, and so on. But the fact is that there is some species, there's what I call here species overlap there, because for any criteria we can think regarding this, there will be humans that will be excluded by it. So as I say, species can be defended in this way, but giving any non-definitional capacity or relationship, there will be humans who lack it. So for instance, if we consider cognitive capacities, we all know that there are many humans who just don't have these capacities. And we can consider the case of children, for instance. Or if you don't think this works in the case of children, consider babies, infants. A 1-year-old baby clearly has cognitive capacities that are more reduced than those many non-human animals have. So if this is a reason to morally exclude those non-human animals, then we should also morally exclude all these human beings, which shows that this argument doesn't distinguish between humans and non-humans. And the same happens if we speak about relationships, because if we speak about sympathy, well, there are many humans for whom no one seems to feel any sympathy. There are humans who are enslaved, for instance, who are enslaved and who also, if we consider power relationships, clearly are in a bad position with regards to those relations. So for any capacity, for any relation, there will be humans who lack it. So speciesism can't be defended. Whatever reason we give in favor of considering humans and not considering non-human animals will also exclude humans. So this is a reason to consider that what matters, after all, as I said before, is well-being and not any of these criteria. So, as I say, these views fail to justify speciesism. So, to conclude, since almost everyone would help humans who were agonizing in the wild, and because speciesism is untenable, we have to conclude we should also help non-human animals who are agonizing in the wild. And because wild animal suffering is so huge, this is a very important task. It's not something that is, well, you know, something that maybe we should care about it in a minor way. No, this is an important issue. Right. So now let's move to the following objection, which is the environmentalist view. I'm going to point out that this view is not based on a sound conception of value. And first, let's consider the argument. It claims that natural processes or other entities that exist due to them, such as species or biocenosis or ecosystems, are valuable, right? Not well-being, but these other entities. Now, the first thing that we should point out here is that this argument only opposes intervention if it's carried out by destroying nature, not if it just modifies nature, right? And also, in this way, we could maybe consider that we may introduce a qualified environmentalist argument, according to which just certain natural processes and entities, that is the one that exists now, are valuable, which is weird, because why are these particular entities valuable and not the ones that existed, like, I don't know, 2,000 years, or maybe not 2,000, but let's say 100,000 years ago? I mean, it wasn't due to a particular intervention that we carried out to improve nature, but because circumstances in nature are changing all the time, environments are changing all the time, biocenoses are changing all the time, species are changing. So why should we stop evolution in this particular moment and say, no, it is this that is valuable? And if species, biocenosis, and ecosystems aren't particularly, currently existing ecosystem and species aren't particularly valuable over others, then there seems to be no reason why we should intervene and change the way things are if nature will be in a different way. Because it's been going on like this all the time. Right. So we could consider that this view is wrong regarding value due to this paradox, and also due to other reasons. We may consider that it is individual, not processes or groups of systems, that are the real location of value and the ones to take care of. Why? Well, to take care for, because they are the only ones who are experiencing well-being and suffering, right? And we can see this in our case. I mean, we don't value ourselves because we are members of a certain species or of a certain, nation. We value ourselves because, well, you know, we live happy lives, or we try to, right? So we can then claim also that the environmental argument is defended for speciesist reasons. And the reason why this is so is that we don't hold it when it comes to humans. So let's consider this example. Housing the homeless. Suppose that in a certain city, we build some houses for the homeless in a place in which there were no human constructions before. So there were the homeless, and they were suffering terribly, and they were maybe dying in the winter because it's too cold and so. So we build in an empty place in which there is just some grass and whatever. We build some houses. Well, what happens is that if opposing housing the homeless is wrong, then opposing intervention to help wild animals have to be wrong too. Why? Because in that place, even if we consider it empty, there was some ecosystem. There were some arthropods there were some insects, some spiders, there was some grass there, and so on, right? So the claim is that would environmentalists here applaud natural health for humans? And the fact is that with some exceptions, most of them do. Well, there is this guy, this Pentti Linkola from Finland, who claims that AIDS is a great thing, and the Holocaust and the Second World War was a great thing because it eliminated humans who are destroying nature. But most environmentalists don't hold this view, right? So, or at least I want to talk here about the environmentalists who defend this claim, because there may be other environmentalists who support helping animals in nature, right? So this environmentalist objection should be rejected. But then we also have the pessimistic view. Intervention cannot succeed. And this view can be presented in these ways. We can consider the argument from helplessness previously. And this argument claims that it is impossible to end suffering and death in nature. It's just not, we won't succeed. I mean, it's such a huge task, and it's such a difficult task that we won't succeed. But we can reply, so what? I mean, because the point is not to end it altogether, it's just to try to help animals as much as we can. So even if we don't end it altogether, maybe we can reduce it a bit. And as I said before, note that this is compatible with being a speciesist, and this is also compatible with being an environmentalist. It's just that there are animals suffering there, and we may help them. And there are some, I'm going to present here some examples at a low scale. We have these floods in Australia that took place a couple of years or so ago, I think. And here we have this guy who is rescuing this kangaroo who will otherwise die. And this is an example of an intervention in nature. You are reducing suffering and death there. You are helping that individual. So it would be absurd to claim that he has no reason to do that because he can't help, he can't end all suffering that there is in nature. And we have this other example. These are wild beasts that every year they migrate. So they go from Tanzania to the north, and they have to cross some rivers. And sometimes every year many of them die, right? And this is actually considered an attraction. Many curious go there and take pictures of this. Yeah, I'm reporting the truth. And it would be obviously very easy to, do some intervention there to try to help them, so make them, to build some paths from which they could save their lives and so on, right? Another example is, this is a low-scale example, again. This is an example of some successful intervention. This was this baby elephant that was trapped in a mud pond and couldn't get out. So his or her mother get into the pond again to save her, but she couldn't. So they were, they weren't able to get out. So they could either drown there or be killed there by predators. For instance, some wild dogs sometimes kill these animals while they are trapped there, and actually they eat them alive sometimes. And they were rescued by some people who were there. They were using strings and so on. So why not? I mean, it's an example of something we can do. And then this other example has to do with vaccinating wild animals against certain diseases. In this particular case, rabies. And as you can see, this is like a screenshot from a paper, and I chose this one because if you can see the date there, it's 1988. So this has been discussed for a while, and this has been put into practice. I mean, wild animals are vaccinated against certain diseases, and it's not that they go there and put the vaccine, but actually they throw these biscuits with some vaccination, with some vaccine or whatever, and not only with rabies but with other diseases. So I, as some of you know already, I like to present this example very much because I think it's a clear example. Because it's something that we are doing it, but we are doing this for our own interest because we don't want them to pass these diseases for us or to domestic animals. But this clearly shows that we could do it for the sake of animals themselves, and that we could do it in the case of other conditions as well if we were concerned with helping animals. So I'm going to claim that the pessimistic view then is very pessimistic because something can be done. And then there is the second argument, which claims that even if this can be done, there is this fear that intervention may have unforeseen consequences, unforeseen effects that could be catastrophic. And well, I'm going to present it in a weak version because there could be a strong version that I'm not going to tackle here because I want to focus rather in this question, which the strong version would claim that intervention always have unforeseen consequences. But this somehow is weird. How can you state that it will have consequences that are unforeseen? I mean, there seems to be some contradiction there, right? So I'm going to just tackle the weak version. And I'm going to claim that the pessimistic view is too pessimistic, and I'm going to do it by comparing two scenarios. The first one is real world. We've seen that on average, for each animal that reproduces, only one of his offspring survives. So given an offspring of, say, 10,000 animals, as I said before, you remember that only 2 of them survive, right? And now let's consider what happens in a case of a catastrophe, of an unforeseen catastrophe. So suppose that the unforeseen catastrophe is so catastrophic that it reduces animal population to half. What happens there is what I call massive death. Total animal population is reduced to half. And what happens is that massive death is exactly like real world. You can see the difference. The difference is just one of them survives in real world with comparison with massive death. The pessimistic view, after all, is very optimistic regarding how things actually are in nature, right? So as I said, the current situation is already catastrophic. I mean, but this doesn't mean that we can do more harm even. I mean, we could make things even worse. But still, I mean, there are reasons to conclude that we should intervene. This is the conclusion that I want to reach. We should help wild animals because it would be a good thing to alter a natural process to reduce the suffering and the death of non-human animals. So this is surely, I conclude, the right thing to do. And in practical terms, this is now when it comes to what we should do, I think that the most cost-efficient course of action is not to start to intervene right now, or at least not in any significant way, but rather to question speciesism, so these ideas can be furthered, and also to spread this idea, the idea that it is good to help animals in nature, and also to support those interventions that are already feasible and that are already being carried out, and maybe also to do research on ways to help wild animals. So this is basically what I want to say. Thank you. This is the mother elephant after being rescued. So if you have anything that you want to say or object, then I'll be happy to discuss it. Otherwise, if you are shy or whatever, you can get in touch with me there. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.